Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Hydrogen Market Overview 2024, Driving the Shift from Hype to Reality. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. LRQA will share a recording of the webinar with everyone who has registered in the next couple of days. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Any questions that we do not have time to answer during the session will be responded to after in the webinar. Will be responded to you after the webinar. For your information, we will be running some live polls today. Please note the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage result. It is my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today, Leanne Halliday, Corporate Account Manager at LRQA, and Olga Rivas, Technical Cluster Manager at LRQA. Leanne is a chartered chemical engineer with over 20 years experience in the energy sector and works on global accounts associated with hydrogen. Leanne has design commissioning, project management, and sales management experience across the UK, Asian, and Australian markets. She has worked for LRQA for over 11 years, focusing her experience and expertise on helping industry to assure safety and quality across the supply chain. Leanne is currently a member of the Australia Standards Hydrogen Production and Storage Working Group, ISO TC WG27 and 33 fuel quality, and engaged in hydrogen projects globally. She's currently based in Western Australia, where there's a significant potential for the development of a green hydrogen market for export. Olga has 25 years experience advising and auditing business and environmental, energy, health and safety risks, as well as helping organizations to drive culture change. She has participated in verification projects for sustainability, reports, and non-financial information. This includes extensive senior level engagement with large companies on climate change, energy, sustainability verification, and certification. Prior to this role, Olga worked a consultant, trainer, and auditor in environmental, energy, and health and safety management systems, and providing assessment and verification services for greenhouse gas emissions and other sustainability data, ISO 14001, and social auditing schemes. She has since held various roles with LRQA related to management, training, auditors, and verifiers, and leading complex verifications. Before we get started, bear with me, I'm sorry, we have our first poll question for the day. Just a reminder, the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage result. Our first poll question is, what challenges do you think need to be addressed for wide span adoption of hydrogen? Tick all that apply. The first response is cost, access to finance. The second response is lack of infrastructure availability. The third response is public acceptance. The fourth response is regulatory uncertainty. And the fifth response is lack of technical expertise. We'll give you a few moments to respond. And again, the question is, what challenges do you think need to be addressed for wide-span adoption of hydrogen? We'll give it just another moment or two. And thank you for your responses. The top answer is lack of infrastructure availability at 75%. And thanks for that. I will now hand over to Leanne to begin the session.
Thanks, Wendy, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm pleased to be speaking to you this evening from Perth, Australia, where I'm currently based. I'm just a little bit confused here. I can just see my face, Wendy. I can't see the slides.
That is my mistake. Bear with me just a second. Nope. Don't be sorry. That is my mistake.
While Wendy's fixing that, I'll just talk to them poll answers which came through. So nothing I saw there was surprising. When I go through my presentations, you'll see I talk a lot about the cost element, access to finance, which inadvertently actually speaks to the lack of infrastructure as well, and the importance of having hubs and working in a collaborative manner. Also seen that the second response there were about regulatory compliance, and regulatory uncertainty is also one of the key risks that we're seeing across the globe, and something that my presentation will also speak to. So very happy that we're aligned, and hopefully I can support you with some of them responses.
You should have control now, Leanne.
I do. Thank you very much, Wendy. So like I said, my name's Leanne Halliday. I've worked in the hydrogen sector probably full time now for the past 3 years, and really working with companies across the globe, both suppliers, operators and regulators, to help to make, I guess, this industry a reality. There's a hype around the industry, as we all know. You look on LinkedIn, I'm sure you all get emails every day inviting you to conferences around hydrogen. There's a lot of news articles around hydrogen. But what actually is the reality? What are we seeing in the marketplace? And what is stopping us moving from this massive hype into hydrogen really being a key and pivotal role in our energy transition? A lot of the presentation which I'll be showing you today is based on some data analysis which I've been tracking for the last 3 years, and how we're seeing trends in the industry. Trends which are showing massive peaks and massive demand in hydrogen projects, and then a reality check on them of what is actually happening and what we're seeing. We'll then look into more of the risks about what is stopping this move from hype to reality, and how we, as people in the industry, stakeholders in the industry, can actually help to make a difference. So let's move on to my first slide. And a slide which I always put up when I'm talking about hydrogen, and one that I'm sure answers many questions. We're talking about hydrogen in the context of energy transition. We all have our Earth to protect. Climate change is a reality. Our Earth's temperatures are increasing year on year. We've seen an increase in global disasters. If it's floods or fires, very prevalent to where I live in Perth. We had a week of 40+ degree days this year, which we've never seen for many, many years. It's a reality, it's happening. We need to do something to protect our Earth. We're also seeing that the world is also pushing towards this. Every country, in fact 60+ countries, have a net zero target. I've just chose one there. India, net zero by 2070. A lot of countries are net zero by 2030, etc. There's also been a massive amount of money being spent in this space to allow us to meet these ambitions, but also our COP28 targets that have been set on an international level. It says there, a news article I just took a snapshot on from Seoul, energy transition investments hit $1 trillion. When you start to get into trillions, hundreds of billions, it's just a lot of money that's been spent in this space. Each individual company is also setting their own targets. So I've put there our own target. LRQA is committed to net zero with a very transparent approach through Our Planet, Our Plan by 2030. And I've also put down their Shell's goals as well, but that's just one example. Hydrogen is not the only solution to reach these targets, but it is a solution, and it's a solution that's available now. I always put this slide up because I want to tell you that I'm not a member of any hydrogen shares, any hydrogen operators. I'm not an advocate for the industry, but I do believe that it is part of our solution to hit our net zero targets. Why do I believe that? Because it's not new technology. It's technology that's available now. And yes, talking to the infrastructure and talking to the cost part, We do need innovations in technology to make it wide scale, etc., and also to grow the supply chain, but it's not new technology. It's also a transportable energy form. This is particularly interest of countries that don't necessarily have the capacity to produce the energy transition fluids that they need themselves, but can rely on other countries. So the example sitting here in Australia is our neighbours of South Korea and Japan, who are hungry for their own hydrogen, but don't have the natural resources or the landmass to be able to do that themselves. However, we do have that in Australia, and we're looking at building plants that we can transport hydrogen through ammonia, through liquid hydrogen, which has its own technical issues, or other sources to these locations. Hydrogen also is the most abundantly available gas in the atmosphere. It's not available on its own. It's very much caught up in water a lot of the time, but it is available. And there's a lot of really exciting projects out there around the gold or white hydrogen projects, which is looking at getting hydrogen out of the ground. That's not going to be available for a few years yet. It's very much in research stage, but there is a lot of players that we have now and in the future. So now let's look at some data. Before I go on to that, just some more commitments. So we talked about hydrogen not being the only solution, but a lot of our governments have also put in place commitments around hydrogen to show that they have some faith in it. And this is around 4 main areas. So it's around mobility, energy, fertilizers, and steel. Fertilizers being the traditional use of hydrogen. So global spend producing hydrogen energy purposes by 2050 is estimated around $6.8 trillion. Again, massive figures like that. If that's 7 trillion or 1 trillion, it doesn't matter. It's a lot of money. At least 60 countries have published or are drafting hydrogen strategies. Just last month, well, January, 2 months ago, India produced their strategy for hydrogen, heavily focused around the mobility industry, but we're seeing massive projects taken away in India and a lot of interest in this space. The global target is after additional capacity between 160 to 210 gigawatts of hydrogen production by 2030 to support the energy transition. We have to put that in context. A lot of them projects will involve the use of electrolysis. The current manufacturing capacity of electrolysis is around 20 gigawatts per year. We'll need to be upwards of around 100 gigawatts per year in order to even meet these demands. So that shows that one of the risks and one of the areas we need to address is that growth and risk in the supply chain. I've also jotted down there some key countries, and we talked about cost, we talked about infrastructure. We need to get the cost of green hydrogen down from today's around $5 per kilogram, down to around $2. That's a big difference. We're going to have to do that at the initial start by some incentives. Incentives are around in a lot of countries, but they're not necessarily at the level they need to be. They're there to kickstart the industry. They're there to promote some of the smaller startup pilot plants, but we need to look at what's next. How do we get to these large gigawatt scale projects? I've also gave there some figures to give some context of by 2030, the amount of gigawatts that need to be added to the current capacity of each country to meet their targets, and none of them are to be shied away from. So this is the trends I've been looking at, and all the trend data I take is from the IEE database. There is other databases out there and we have been cross-checking against them, but we're mainly looking at trends. So if we look at this first figure here, up on the left-hand side of this top graph, you will see that this is the number of projects, hydrogen projects globally, that are moving from concept stage to production stage between now and 2040. And you'll see year on year, that is increasing dramatically. And in fact, in 2023, the figures show that there is 1,780 projects in that pipeline. That's a 40% year-on-year growth since March 2021 to December 2023. But what I'm more interested in when I'm looking at hydrogen making a significant difference to the energy transition path is the projects that are larger than 10 megawatts. So this rules out a lot of the pilot projects, a lot of the projects that are testing technology, and actually moves on to the more significant projects. And you'll see we're also seeing increase there, with the projects increasing year on year with around 800 now in the pipeline. The next phase of projects is the ones that are greater than a gigawatt. They're the ones that become really exciting. They're the ones that are going to make a big difference in that export market. And you'll see again, we're seeing that increase year on year. But then we put some reality onto these figures and we look back at this table. So I then looked at the projects that are over 10 megawatts and in the next 5 years. And if I look at that, the figure drops to 536. So about a third of the overall projects. So they're the ones that we can see in our foresight. They're the ones that are going to look more like a reality. I then take the next step to reality and I look at the ones greater than 10 megawatts with FID. So that actually have financial investment approval. And it drops down to 69. That is still a 9% increase since last year. And actually 69 projects in the next 5 years at a scale greater than 10 megawatts is still a significant amount of projects. Particularly if we talk about one of the risks, where we're looking at the competency of people who will be needed to build these projects throughout the supply chain. This is something that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, getting asked for support to understand regulatory and standard regimes, and also working with people who are transitioning from different sectors such as power, oil and gas, the motor vehicle industry, into hydrogen and how we can support them in that transition. The next set of data that I looked at is I again looked at them projects that were greater than 10 megawatts and in the next 5 years, and I split it by region. And there's 3 regions there that I really picked out. The first thing that I will say is last year when I did this data, it was all about Europe. And actually, where I've been spending a lot of my time is working on UK, Netherlands, German projects that I particularly had a big go ahead last year. A lot of these projects are at the smaller scale, but they were really pushed ahead to help build the energy supply issue that came across from the Russia-Ukraine war. That still has increased this year on a similar scale, so that projects in them areas are still going ahead. But where we've seen an interesting increase this year, one of them I've already alluded to, was in India. India didn't even show up on the map on the graph last year, whereas you can see here it's having a significant increase. That's that last chart on the graph here at the bottom. That's based on some policy that's being put out there, and also India really pushing for it to be in their manufacturing space and also the mobility space. We also seen a big increase in China in the number of projects that were announced, and particularly those that are at FID. China is still the largest producer of hydrogen globally, and it's looking at how they can decarbonize some of them hydrogen facilities. And not surprising as well, we also saw with the introduction of IRA in Americas last year, an increase higher than most other places of projects announced in North America. What's interesting is not a lot of them projects have FID at the moment. They've been announced, there's a lot of interest in that market, but there's still some concern or some skepticism around them incentives for the long term, and also the rules that are implemented and keep changing. My next slide looks at these gigawatt projects and the ones that really get me excited. And these are a lot smaller, as you would expect. But if we look at the mega projects in the next 5 years, you'll see by no surprise the increase in them have come from Africa, North Asia and South America. These places also have large land masses where they can put a lot of renewable resources such as wind farms and PV solar panels, and they've also got the opportunity for export. Like Australia and South America, that's also been a real place of where we can have export to other countries. But if we look at the projects greater than 10 gigawatts in the next 5 years, there's actually only one that has FID. This is the last data slide that I have and the last reality check, I call it. So this took me looking back. So what I did was I looked at the 2022 data and looked at the projects that were predicted to take place in 2023. So the projects that were predicted to be under construction in 2023. And actually, the reality is only around 30% of them actually got the go-ahead. So some of them aren't even under construction, some of them only have FID. 30% doesn't seem a lot, but when I look back at the same analysis I did from 2021 to 2022, that was only 16%. So it's actually moved on. We are seeing a lot more projects actually going ahead as we move forward. So there is some shining light. It's just not moving as quick as a lot of people are predicting. Of course, all companies want to be shown that they're doing something in the energy transition space. There's also a lot of unicorn companies out there, a lot of new companies entering the market. So these projects that are announced are going to be inflated, but 30% is what we're actually seeing going to market. That's 30% by number and 27% by megawatt value. The key projects that actually did go ahead was in China, like I talk about, and you can see the list there, some in North Europe, some in the USA and Canada, some in India, and some in South America and Brazil. The next slide that I've got on is just something that's in the news at the moment, and I thought was definitely worth noting in this webinar. When we talk about hype to reality, there's also some skepticism that comes into the conversation, particularly in my world when I'm talking to neighbours and friends and family. They all talk about, is this actually going to take place? What's happening? The industry sees big projects being announced, but not many going ahead. So there is that slowdown and some skepticism. We did see at the end of last year and at the start of this year some big news articles around the closure of fueling stations for domestic cars. Some particular examples I've found there is in South Korea and in Shell in California. This is sometimes, I believe, the first mover always takes a risk, and it's always a matter of chicken or egg, right? So what comes first? So sometimes the supply wasn't available for the hydrogen wasn't available to be able to provide to the hydrogen fueling stations, and then the cars weren't available to be able to take the hydrogen from the fueling stations. So the supply and demand wasn't quite there. Also, any of you who've run or commissioned processing plants they never run correctly if they're in ramp down mode. And a lot of these fueling stations were running at ramp down mode because they didn't necessarily have the demand. Also, with all first movers, there's a risk of technology. And that's what we saw in Korea, that they did have a lot of technology issues. So that's a negative, but actually them graphs show that the fueling station capacity and numbers around the world is still large and it's growing, particularly in places like India. We've been supporting a company in India around safety studies to get fueling stations up and running there. And then on the positive slant, I also picked up a news article there from BMW, and they've put out that they're shifting their focus from EV vehicles to hydrogen power vehicles in their research department. So there's always a negative and a positive with every news article, but I thought it was worth putting the elephant in the room out there and some of the news that we're seeing around this industry, which will be driving some of the skepticism in the hype to reality market. So what are the key risks? What's really stopping these projects from going ahead? You need to know your risks to be able to manage your risks. So I've got a table here, and actually I produced this table 3 years ago, and the risks really haven't changed. The words underneath each of these tables have changed slightly as things have moved on, but the risks remain the same. Technology is not new, but like I mentioned earlier, we do need innovation in technology to bring it to a cost point that is going to make the industry a reality. We also need it to make mass production of electrolyzers and electrolyzer components and balance of plant, etc., much more mass produced. So there's innovation around that. We also need a much more diversified supply chain, and also a supply chain where the project's at, because that's not necessarily where they are at the moment, to avoid some of the logistics, etc. Regulations and standards have moved on a lot. Like was mentioned in the introduction, I sit on some ISO working groups and also some Australian standard working groups, and there is a lot of movement in the standards and regulation space. But what is still lacking is a global approach to standards and regulations, particularly in something I'll talk about later when we talk about identifying the carbon content of hydrogen. Carbon content of hydrogen is key to making this industry a reality. It will allow a trade of hydrogen around the world, and it will allow us to build trust to be able to build these green hydrogen plants that really have a value based on the carbon content of what you're producing. Social license to operate is always there. We need to make sure we have the right quality, safety, assurance built into all of our projects to make sure that these do have the real social license to operate and the public are on board with what we're trying to do and is part of the solution for the energy transition. And I talked about competency gap. I talked about how we need to increase knowledge, we need to have cross-sector training, etc. Hydrogen molecule is also the simplest molecule. As a chemical engineer in my process safety background, it's really predictable molecule, but it's also very different to methane and it has to be treated with respect. And a lot of safety studies, people entering the industry have to realise that. A lot of the standards are being adapted to account for that, but we need education around it. So let me focus on a couple of them things. And first of all, let's focus on supply chain. And I thought it's worth just picking out some statistics to be able to show you what the supply chain growth is needed to be able to meet some of these project demands. So it's predicted that the hydrogen compression market will double in the next 10 years. Hydrogen pressure vessels, a lot of pressure vessels are moving from steel and metal compressor vessels into composite materials or GRP, purely because of the way hydrogen reacts with the steel and the leakage rate, etc. That's expected to grow by 18% year on year to be a £900 billion industry by 2027. I've talked about the electrolyzer manufacturing capacity already, but it's a growth exponential, and we're already seeing a lot of electrolyzer manufacturers entering the market and trying to grow rapidly. And also, the manufacturers aren't necessarily where the projects are. So we need to make some of the industries more localized, and that will also help with clustering to help with some of the infrastructure issues as well. So I think I've already addressed this, but some of the things that we need to do is we need to work in collaboration. These projects are massive. The challenge that we're trying to fix, the energy transition targets that have been put in place are massive. We've all racing ahead to be able to hit these, and we're actually falling behind in that race. So we have to move away from old ways of thinking within industry, and we need to collaborate. When I look around the world and I look at where hydrogen projects are working well, it's where hubs have been developed and hubs have been incentivized. So you're sharing infrastructure, you're working together across projects to be able to attack the supply chain, giving notice to the supply chain of your demands and being able to work with your supply chain collaboratively also to be able to make their products meet your needs. We also need to work on standards road mapping. So we're not just looking at standards today, but we're looking at what's coming in the next year. Many projects have been caught out that they've built or they've designed to standards that are available now. When they go to construction, they've moved on, the standards have moved on. So we need to be lobbying regulations and standards group. We need to be having input into them standards to be able to understand what our journey is going to be, not just today, but in the future when these projects become a reality. And also, we as LRQA are supporting industry to help get products to market. A lot of innovation is happening, like I've spoke about. Innovation is always hard to sell into a sector. Therefore, what we do is we help manufacturers to really understand the risks associated, the standards associated with that particular product, and we can certify that or verify that as approved in principle to be used in the hydrogen market, helping companies to have a quicker route to market for their particular products. This is probably the biggest thing. And whenever I talk at conferences or wherever I attend conferences, webinars, it's always finance. People can't get finance for their projects. And that's because we need a different approach to finance and a different way of thinking. And that's across every stakeholders in the place. So across banks, industry, government, and the consumer, all of us will be paying electricity bills. All of us will be paying gas bills. We can't expect our electricity and gas bills to be the same, particularly as we're moving into this energy transition. We should expect, and we should be willing to take that peak in energy costs as we move through this cycle. We also need to educate governments and banks on the needs of the industry and what we need to be able to make this a reality, what infrastructure needs. And banks and financiers have to look at it differently. the right technical diligence, redefined with new goals. The goal now, the KPIs, are not just return on investment. The KPIs are also what difference are you making to the planet? What difference are you making to the carbon intensity of that project? How are you reducing the carbon of that project and helping to protect our Earth? We also need some consistent and trusted incentives. We need to lobby and keep people informed what's stopping them incentives from not working. What incentives do we need in order to make it a reality? Then incentives need to be set in stone from day one. They need to be long term. They need to be able to give us commitment and trust for the length of a project, not just for the startup or pilot stage of a project. If I was to summarise this slide, I think it's a stakeholder engagement and redefining KPIs and redefining goals of due diligence in order to change the way that we look at finance. My final section again talks about the regulation and maturity and consistency a little bit more. And I think the key here is that slide there. These hydrogen fuel cell cars are entirely pollution free. Well, how carbon intensity was the hydrogen? Where's the hydrogen come from? We can all sit very nice driving a hydrogen car that's been produced by coal. How do we get some verification and certification within that supply chain based on consistent regulations to be able to show that the hydrogen sector is actually making a difference? We've also seen some headlines there. Fortescue Woodside hydrogen hopes in doubt after US rule change. Another example recently where the IRA rules changed and then projects were put on hold. Repsol in Spain freezes hydrogen investment in northern Spain on regulatory uncertainty. That's from October 2023. So the news headlines, the large projects are out there to show us that inconsistency. And something that I've alluded to, one of the things that I think would make a big difference to moving from hype to reality is having a consistent way in which we certify and in which we classify the carbon content of the hydrogen. This would allow a global trade of hydrogen and also to allow people to put more effort into reducing the carbon of their hydrogen produced, as they would be able to get a higher value on it on a world stage. My colleague Olga is going to talk a little bit around in the next session around what's available at the moment from carbon accountancy, carbon certification, greenhouse gas verification, and how we can take them lessons and move them into the hydrogen sector. Most places in the world do have some regulations or are working on schemes currently, but there's no alignment across these schemes. Probably the most advanced one is CERT-HY, which is in Europe, but again, that has these issues. And the next slide just really gives an idea if there's issues. I won't go through them, but one, I've said it's not consistent globally. It's also voluntary. There's also no key or agreed benchmarking criteria. And also the boundaries for some of these schemes are quite narrow. So you might only have to look at the carbon intensity of your particular processing facility and not your supply chain. And that could be very different for different supply chains. So you're only looking at scope 1 and 2, not scope 3. And that really does just sway the results quite widely in some respects. So you could be going back to that cartoon, actually not understanding what your hydrogen is coming from and what impact it is actually having. There is some light at the end of the tunnel though, and my next slide shows that. So in COP28, there was a declaration of intent on mutual recognition of certification schemes put in place. And this is basically about having a trusted hydrogen trading market. 30+ countries did sign up to that. So we're all sitting there tight, hoping that this is going to make the difference and help to move the hydrogen sector from hype to reality. Happy to take your questions later, but I'll hand over to Olga now. Wendy, is that over to you now?
Forgive me for that. Thank you so much, Leanne. And just a reminder that you can ask questions through this presentation by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. Questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar during our Q&A session. And before we turn it over to Olga, we do have another poll question. Where is your organization in its carbon footprinting journey? The first response is curious about carbon footprint measurement. The second response is early stages of implementation. The third response is calculating emissions and carbon footprint. The fourth response is preparing for reporting and verification. And the fifth response is reduction management and mitigation of carbon footprint. We'll give everybody a few moments to respond. And again, just to reread the question, where is your organization in its carbon footprinting journey? We'll give it just a few more minutes. We are just about ready to show that response. And here are the responses. Thank you everyone for responding. And Olga, do you have any comments as to the results?
Yes, hello first, good day. In relation with the response, we have here something that we know that there are companies that are in the stage of reduction, management and mitigation, and there are others that are in the early stage of implementation. So we have two different scenarios we are finding in our clients, two very different scenarios in the level of implementation depending on the stage that they are. These results will help us to tailor our webinar session and adapt our content to try to meet all these two majority answers. Okay, so let's go with this session. Thank you, Liam, first, because it was a very interesting session, in my opinion. And in this short session, we want to briefly outline the context of how we will achieve these zero emissions objectives through a global vision. By utilizing all the available tools to turn this vision into reality. So we will focus in 2 points that we'll cover in this session. The first point that I would like to make is that assurance empowers organizations to achieve their energy transition and carbon neutrality objectives with confidence, effectiveness, and give the priority to the actions. You need a single source of truth, serving as the unique credible information and data externally and also internally. And the second one is that the availability of tools such as the ISO 14068 standard about carbon neutrality verifications, which helps companies systematically achieve their carbon neutrality. So go to the next one, to the next slide, and we will go to the facts. No? Let's look into the realities of our clients. So many of our clients have been encouraged by regulators, investors, and also other clients to commit to carbon neutrality. With the 70% of the GDP now covered by a net zero target, because national, regional, or country level net zero is becoming a reality for many companies. However, turning these commitments into actions requires a comprehensive planning and an understanding of the impact of decarbonization on a business. It's crucial to set achievable ambitions backed by science while remaining flexible enough to adapt to evolving ideas, technologies, and regulations. Many companies state their ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier in their reports, or they explain another target another target. However, very few clearly describe their company's strategy to achieve these decarbonization targets. The race to net zero cannot be won alone, and it requires the involvement of other players, companies, value chains such as suppliers, distributors, packaging, and logistic providers, retailers, and other business partners. Next one, please. So let's take a moment to explore the significant developments in climate change in recent years. As you know, starting around 2005, we saw the introduction of emission trading regulations by various regulators. This is a market-based mechanism aiming to reduce CO2 emissions. However, a more impactful shift has been in investor expectations. Investors now place a strong emphasis on the climate performance of the companies they invest in. They are increasingly aware of the risks associated with not meeting decarbonization targets, and these investors expect companies to provide accurate, comparable information and roadmaps supported by internationally recognized metrics and scientific evidence. There are some initiatives. For example, one of them is Net Zero Asset Managers, which is an initiative launched by a group of 30 global asset managers committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions from their investment portfolios by 2050 or earlier, establishing clear and realistic roadmaps to carbon neutrality and to regularly report on their progress. Furthermore, has been a noticeable increase in the demand for sustainable products and services from society. For example, it will be familiar for you that there are some companies that are accused of greenwashing because they fail to fulfill their climate change promises or their plans lack a scientific backing. In this context, we achieved the first of the point that I mentioned at the beginning, that is, how can an organization build that trust? And independent assurance is the key, because building credibility through independent assurance demonstrates an organization's commitments to transparently monitor its progress towards its goal. Accurate reporting, verify an independent entity is now vital. If we go to the next one, please. We talk about carbon neutrality. When we talk about this carbon neutrality, there are several standards that address this topic. But the most interesting one right now is the ISO 14068, which includes the principles, requirements, and phases for verifying an organization's carbon neutrality. And as you can see here, it all starts with measuring and verifying your organization's emissions. And you can use ISO 14064 Part 1 or the GHG protocol that include the Scope 1 direct emissions, Scope 2 emissions and direct from electricity, and the Scope 3 that are all other emissions that are not covered in the other scopes. Once you have measured and externally verified your emissions, you can start with your energy efficiency or emission reduction plan, or look for other sources with lower emissions, for example, hydrogen certificates of origin that, as you know, don't contribute to emit CO2 in a transparent way, and you can take into account this percentage of content of carbon that Lian is mentioned before. Or there are other companies that are changing some of their processes or services. Sometimes we think that these emissions reductions are only about the aspects that we control, such as the emissions of our sites. However, there is a great opportunity in the Scope 3 emissions, which in many companies account for more than 80% of the total emissions. And finally, we have the opportunity to offset emissions that cannot be reduced. We can go to the next slide to conclude, please. And we will provide some tips based on the best practices that organizations can use to achieve the implementation and verification of a decarbonization plan according to their objectives. We have included 5 high-level tips. The first one is that to achieve carbon neutrality, you will start by establishing an accurate baseline carbon footprint across all the scopes 1, 2, and 3. And it could be in relative or absolute units or both. The second one is that you could work on assessing the business impact of achieving net zero, identifying risks and opportunities. Another important tip is that you can use your certified management system, including your decarbonization goals into your management system that is already proven. And another tip is build capability and awareness in your organization, as this is key to go to the action. And the final tip is target quick wins to reduce the scope 1 and 2 emissions. On the other hand, we can also apply the hierarchies of other fields, such as starting with eliminations of ESG throughout the life cycle. Secondly, reduce what cannot be eliminated with energy efficiency plans or substitution of more carbon intensive activities and sources with less intensive approach, like certificates of warranty, of hydrogen warranty and renewable energy. And lastly, neutralize only what is unavoidable through the acquisition of offset. In summary, we strongly recommend having a comprehensive view of the carbon footprint of your organization, and following a verified decarbonization plan, which will allow us to gradually progress toward our decarbonization goals across our entire supply chains, including our suppliers. Thank you for your attention and participation in this webinar.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Olga. I'll finally kick off with our final poll question for today before we start on our Q&A session. Our final poll question is, will you seek any of the following hydrogen services in the next 12 months? The first response is yes, regulatory advice and training. The second response is yes, equipment or product inspection and certification. The next response is yes, project and supply chain assurance. The fourth response is yes, GHG verification or hydrogen certificate of origin. And lastly, no, I'm not interested in any of the above. And we'll give everybody a few moments to respond. And again, the question is, will you seek any of the following hydrogen services in the next 12 months? We'd like everybody to weigh in on the answers. And we'll give it just another moment or two. Okay, I think that just about will wrap it up. Let's go ahead and see the responses. And Leanne, do you have any comments as to the results?
Yes, I guess that's what we're seeing in the industry. So definitely the immediate need we're seeing is around regulatory advice and training and supply chain assurance. But we're also getting a lot greenhouse gas verification. We don't want it in the next 12 months, but we want to know what's happening in that regulation space now. So that sort of reflects what we're seeing on a global scale. Yeah, if you just pop back a slide, Wendy, just before we close.
Certainly, bear with me. to this slide?
Yes, so just wanted to just close on this one. So why LRQA and what are we doing? So we're supporting hydrogen projects, like I said, working with supply chains, manufacturers, operators, regulators around the globe. And we're working with hydrogen projects in 14 different countries across all of the key areas, so mobility, traditional industries, and energy transition. We do have global reach. We have assessors, inspectors, consultants across the globe. And we are working across that hydrogen project. So from the pilot projects all the way up to greater than 10 megawatt projects currently.
All right,
Thanks, Wendy.
perfect. Oh, you're very welcome. We will begin our Q&A session at this point. Again, if you have any questions to submit, please submit those through the questions pane of your attendee control panel. Let's start with our first question. I believe this one is for you, Olga. I have a team of 5 and would like to upskill them on GHD and the ISO 14604. And do you have any recommendations on what we can use?
Yes, for upskilling your team of 5 on GHD and ISO 14064, I will recommend exploring LRQA training courses. We have comprehensive training programs tailored to various levels of expertise and also public courses. There is one very appropriate for a team that is starting to measure that is called ISO 14064 Part 1 Implementation and Verification course that is published in our web page that could be a good option to explore. But you can contact with our training team and they can make a tailored program for you.
Perfect, thank you. The next question I believe is for Leanne. What is the process of verification of ISO 14068 and what is the output? I'm sorry, that actually is for Olga, forgive me.
Yes.
Okay, yes.
Forgive me on that.
Yes, the verification process starts with a kickoff meeting to present our methodologies, deadlines, processes, and later there are 2 stages. The stage 1 is called strategic analysis and risk analysis, and in this first stage, we will check that your decarbonization plan is aligned with the requirements and principles of ISO 14068. And you will obtain a verification plan outlining the scope, objectives, criteria, and the methodology for the stage 2. And the stage 2 is the verification process that mainly the verifier team collects and evaluates the relevant data, documentation, and information provided by you to assess the accuracy, completeness, consistency, and transparency of your decarbonization plan. The outputs are mainly 2. The primary is an assurance statement that this assurance statement confirms whether the decarbonization project conforms the requirements of the ISO and indicating the outcome of the verification process. And the second is a report that you can find, for example, identify non-conformities, discrepancies, errors, or areas of non-compliance, and of course, recommendation for improvement. So this verification process provides you assurance to your stakeholders like investors, regulators, customers, and in general, the public.
Awesome, thank you for that, Olga. And this one is for you, Leanne.
Good.
How does hydrogen compare with other renewable energy sources in terms of sustainability?
A very good question. And that's one of the ways I always put up that first slide, that hydrogen is not the only solution for this energy transition market. It's one of the solutions. If I was going to say what is the biggest advantage of hydrogen, it's probably its transportable nature. So most other renewable energies, you have to consume the energy where you make it. So if you've got wind, you have to consume it where you've made it, etc. Whereas with hydrogen, you can transport it through mediums such as ammonia, methanol, and even liquid hydrogen. So that would probably be my biggest advantage of hydrogen.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Leanne. And we're going to give you another one. How big is the major hydrogen project operating nowadays?
Yes, so I saw that one, and I've actually had a look at the database while you were talking. So actually, the biggest projects are in China currently, and they're around around the 200 megawatt phase. We drop straight down from that 200 megawatts down to around 20 megawatts, which is the next ones. And there's a range of 20 megawatts in Spain, Canada, Taiwan, Peru, and the USA. So there's not many large ones out there, and it's a big jump from 20 to 200 as well.
Perfect, thank you. This next question is for Olga. Can you share insights into the specific challenges and benefits of aligning an organization with ISO 14068 to achieve carbon neutrality?
Yes, of course. Aligning the organization with the ISO 14068 presents both challenges and benefits. I will start by the challenges. So the first one is that the organizations have to implement a rigorous carbon accounting practices such as those outlining in the ISO 14064 Part 1 or the GHG protocol. The second is that the organization have to set achievable reduction targets that they will be aligned with consistent reduction plans. And in my opinion, the third one is that the organization have to effectively engage in the stakeholders. These are the three challenges, in my opinion. However, the benefits are numerous, including that a company can demonstrate enhanced environmental performance, improve resource efficiency, and inclusion or discovering new alternatives, as for example, these hydrogen certificates or other new technologies. And the most important, in my opinion, is that they will increase competitiveness and enhance reputation. Because the verification under ISO 14068 demonstrate a commitment to sustainability and showcases that your organization not only has a goal, but also has clear strategies and plans in place to achieve this objective.
Thank you so much for that, Olga. And the next question is for you, Leanne. Is there any funding for major hydrogen projects?
That's a difficult question to ask because it's very different depending on different regions. There's a lot of incentives out there for kickstarting the hydrogen projects, but a lot of them are at the smaller scale, like I said, for the pilot projects, etc. However, some governments are also now looking at the next stage. So what do we need to do to be able to incentivize the larger projects, which are really going to make a difference? And we're also seeing actually it's not necessarily the country where the project will take place, but it's the people who want to buy or the country that wants to buy the hydrogen that's actually putting some incentives in. So for example, we're looking at a lot of collaboration at the moment here in Australia with Japan and Korea about how we can collaboratively work together to make the industry a reality.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Leanne. And I think we have time for one more question. And I believe this one is also for you, Leanne. What are the key personnel roles in hydrogen in the hydrogen industry? How can oil and gas personnel upskill for transition to hydrogen?
Yeah. Again, good question. And I would say it's exactly the same roles in hydrogen as we have in oil and gas. It's just about how we apply that knowledge and how we apply that experience. I can give you a really good example. I worked a lot in flow assurance in my early days, and in flow assurance, a lot of the process engineers and engineers on the line will know what I'm talking about. When you go from a large volume to a small volume, then you get the Joule Thomson effect and a decrease in temperature, and it causes issues. Hydrogen, because of its small molecular nature, you actually get the opposite in a lot of cases. So when you're going from large volume to short volume, you can get an increase in temperature. I was working in the hydrogen space for 2 years, and I didn't realise that until it was pointed out to me by somebody in the process safety. So what I would say is what I said in my presentation: hydrogen is a simple molecule. However, it needs to be treated with respect, and moving from working in oil and gas with methane predominantly, and then moving into working in hydrogen, you have to understand the differences and go in with your eyes open and always ask questions.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you to you both, Leanne and Olga, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email over the next few days with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. On behalf of LRQA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.